So, welcome back, and let's explore more things in this lecture in this second part of this video series. So, we have already gone through the mental models for learnable interfaces. So, let's start uh, by the representations, that how we can actually represent uh, the mental models. So let's start with the representations. So the most powerful tool in our arsenal is to ensure users have effective mental models of our systems in form of representations. We get to choose how things are visualized to users, and so we get to choose some of how their mental model develops. Using good representations can make all the difference between effective and ineffective mental models. Now recall what we discussed in this figure. Now basically, how do the designer uh, can design the conceptual model based on his or her perception of the user, so that the user can easily understand the real system, the working of the real system. Now what the designer can do is, designer can make the representations good enough so that the user should easily get, or user should easily understand the working of the real system, and uh, the mental model will be naturally learnable to the user itself. So the designing representations can help a lot to improve the mental model, to improve the mental models, and to make the mental models more learnable, as we discussed here. So let's take an example. Let's look at let me just on my pointer. So let's look at some instructions for assembling things. So here are the instructions for a cat tree that have been put together. I'm pretty sure the designer thought that it would be a good representation, but to me it looks like a lot complex. You can kind of see how things fit together from bottom to the top. The problem here is that this representation doesn't actually map the physical construction of the cat tree itself. You can even see some bizarre mismatches even within this representation. So here it looks like this pillar is in the front, but the screw hole that goes into it is actually shown in the back. But we are not looking up into the bottom of that piece, because in the middle piece they actually map up pretty well. Again, that isn't the way the actual piece works. That is not the physical embodiment of the mental, or the augmented embodiment of the physical structure of the cat tree. So anyway, the point is, this is a poor representation for the furniture as how it actually works, because it wasn't a real mapping between this representation and the real pieces. Lately, I found a good representation for putting together some office furniture. Now these are two of the steps from Hutch to put together a desk. For the piece on the left, there is a perfect mapping between the way this piece worked and the way the screw holes were actually aligned on the piece. One clever thing that they did is they actually showed this little screw hole that isn't used for this step. That helps understand the mapping between this piece and the physical one. And understand that when I saw that screw hole that didn't have a screw for it, that was okay, because I do not have to look for the missing screw, because by this I know that I do not have to do anything with that particular screw hole. It would be natural to think we only need to show what users actually need to do, but including that screw hole helps users understand the mapping between this representation and the actual piece. This more complicated step over on the right actually ends up pretty intuitive as well. Although it's small and the details are very hard to see, the arrows they put along here makes it pretty easy to see the directions you had to move things in order to put these pieces together. That's especially useful in places like up here, where the screw hole actually isn't available in this diagram. But I can see that there is a screw hole here because of the way they represent it going in that hole. I can look at the arrangement of these pieces and get a good feel for how the pieces are meant to fit together. So this representation is helpful in understanding the problem in a way that the other representations did not. So let's look at the representations in problem solving approach. So a good representation of our problem will make the solution self-evident. Let's take a classic example of this. So let's see, the hiker starts climbing a mountain at 7 a.m. He arrives at the cabin on top at 7 p.m. The next day, he leaves the cabin at 7 a.m. He arrives at the bottom at 7 p.m. Now the question is, was the hiker ever at the same point at the same time on both days? So let's revisit the problem again. The hiker goes up the hill on one day, stays the night, and then goes back down the hill the next day. And we want to know, was the hiker ever at the same point at the same time on both days? So what's your opinion on this? What's the answer? Think about it. Take a minute or two. Revisit the problem again with respect to the given representation and see whether you can answer it or not with respect to the given representation. So after thinking about it, let me tell you the answer, and the answer is yes. But whether this representation does the justice for answering that particular question, that's up to you. So if you have got the right answer, let me know in the Google Classroom that what representation in your mental model, like what representation you designed in your mental model, what things you simulated. But let me tell you another way to represent this problem in a more, efficient way. So describe the way we describe it right here. It might actually seem odd that there is a point where the hiker is in the same place at the same time on both days. That seems like a strange coincidence. But what if we tweak the representation a little bit? Instead of one hiker going up and then coming down the next day, let's visualize the 2 days at the same time. If we represent the problem like this, we'll quickly see that the hiker has to pass himself, and to pass himself, he has to be in the same point at the same time. This representation took a hard problem and made it very easy, because you do not have to focus in your mind or to simulate the working of this system and to focus that how actually it might have worked. So the representations makes it easier for you. It makes you focus more on the task rather than the simulation in your mental models. Now let's take another example. So for simple problems, identifying a good representation can be easy. But what about more complex problems? For those problems, we might need some examples of what makes a good representation. So let's try a complex example now. We'll use a problem with which you might be familiar. Of course, I'll change the name of that particular example to make you understand that how this representation things work. So for now, I'll call it the circles and squares problem. On one side of the table, I have 3 circles and 3 squares. My goal is to move the 3 circles and the 3 squares to the other side of the table. I can only move two shapes at a time, and the direction of the moves must alternate, starting with a move to the right. Sorry. Sorry. So the number of squares on either side can never outnumber the number of circles unless there are no circles at all on that side. Sorry for the pause. I think this would make a problem for you to understand the representation. So let me repeat the goal again. So on one side of the table, I have three circles and three squares. My goal is to move the three circles and three squares to the other side of the table. I can only move two shapes at a time, and the direction of the moves must alternate, starting with a move to the right. The number of squares on either side can never outnumber the number of circles unless there are no circles at all on that side. How many moves does it take to accomplish this? Now, you can take 5 minutes, you can take 1 hour, you can take 3 hours. What you can do is you can just stop the video right here and try to simulate it in your brain, that how this problem might or how you can come up with a solution to this problem, and you can answer it in the comment section, or you can answer it in the Google Classroom. The question will remain this, that how many moves does it take to accomplish this? Now I assume that you have paused it if you are solving it, but if you are not solving it, I will continue to explain a better representation for this problem. So by providing the representation as I did, if you can solve it, bravo. But if you cannot, I cannot blame you for this, as the representation is so poor. There are a lot of weaknesses in this representation. Let's step through how we would improve it. The first thing we can do is simply write the problem out like this. Audio is a poor representation of complex problems. So here's the written representation of the problem. If the trouble you were having solving the exercise was just remembering all the rules, having this written down would be a huge help. But we can still do a lot better than this. Instead, we can represent the problem visually like this. Here we have the shapes, the three circles and the three squares, and we can imagine actually moving them back and forth like this. That arrow in the center represents the direction of the next move. But can we do better than this? Of course we can do better than this. Right now we have to work to compare the number of squares and circles. So let's line them up like this. This makes it very easy to compare and make sure that the circle always outnumber the squares. And we can still do the same manipulation. Now the only remaining problem is that we have to keep in working memory the rule that squares may not outnumber circles. Now there is no natural reason why I need more squares than circles. It's just kind of an arbitrary rule. So let's make it more self-evident. Let's make the squares bulls and the circles sheep. Now as long as the sheep outnumber the wolves, the sheep can defend themselves. Kind of. But if the wolves ever outnumber the sheep, they will eat them. But if there are no sheep, then there is nothing for the wolves to eat. So that's okay. So now we have a new representation of the problem, one that will make the problem much easier to solve. The rules are more obvious and it's easier to evaluate whether or not they are being met. Finally, we can make this visualization even a little bit more useful by actually showing the movements between the different states, like this. So that way we can see that for any state in the problem there's a finite number of next legal states. This would also allow us to notice when we accidentally revisited an earlier state so we can avoid going in circles. For example, from this state, we might choose to move the wolf and the sheep back to the left, but we'll immediately notice that would make the state the same as this one. And it's not useful to backtrack and revisit an earlier state. So we know not to do that. So these representations have made it much easier to solve this problem than just the verbal representation we started with. Now let's see the characteristics of the good representation. What are the characteristics of a good representation? That's the first question that would arise in your mind. So the first is the good representations make relationships explicit. Laying things out like the one we saw in previous slide makes it easy to tell that there are more sheep than wolves. Now the second is good representations bring objects and relationships together. Representing these or the previous example as wolves and sheep makes that relationship that the sheep must outnumber the wolves, which is much more salient than using squares and circles. That brings the objects together with the relationships between them. Third is a good representation excludes extraneous details. For example, sometimes this problem is described in the form of having a river and a port, but those details aren't actually relevant to solving the problem at all. So we have left them out of here. All we need to know is they need to move from the left to the right. Doesn't matter if it's a river, a boat. This is all the information that we need. So we left out the extraneous information. The fourth is a good representation expose natural constraints. Now we described these or the previous example as sheep and wolves because it makes it easier to think about the rules that wolves may never outnumber sheep. Now of course this is not the best rule because we know that sheep can't actually defend themselves against wolves. 3 sheep and 1 wolf, the wolf still wins. However, if we visualize this as guards and prisoners instead, it involves holding in working memory the idea that prisoners inexplicably won't flee if they are left without any guards. So personally, I think the wolves and sheep metaphor is better. But perhaps the original name of the problem which we discussed was even better. This was originally described as the cannibals and the missionaries problem. It makes more sense that a missionary could defend themselves against a cannibal than a sheep could defend themselves against a wolf. But then the cannibals and missionaries problems make it a little bit dark for the educational purposes, of course. So let's stick with sheep and wolves. Let's see some design challenges in the form of representations. Let's take an example of redesigning a representation to create a better mapping with a task. Here we have a circuit breaker, and on the right we have the list of breakers, and on the left we have what they actually control. Now in order to reset a breaker, and I need to go down the list on the right, find the one I want, count down on the left to find the right breaker and switch it. How can we make this representation of what each breaker corresponds to better? Take the time to think over it and come up with the ideas that how to make this representation much better and to make the life much easier. Now there are a number of things that we can do here. The simplest change we could make would simply be to make the breakers themselves writable. Like this. Instead of writing a list on the right that we have to then map up to the breakers themselves on the left, we can just write on each breaker what it controls. That way we just have to look at the breakers themselves to find the breaker that we are interested in. But then they still have to manually scan through all of them. We can further augment this by having a floor plan over here that actually gives the numbers on the floor plan for the breaker we want, like this. So now I know that this breaker belongs to floor 1, or this breaker belongs to floor 18, or this breaker belongs to floor 14. So all I have to do is to jump straight to the room that I am interested in or the floor I am interested in, find the number, go over the list of breakers and the label written on it, would then confirm that I chose the right one. Now, if I wanted to get really crazy, we could actually lay out the breakers themselves to corresponding to the floor plan, like this. So we can have a floor plan and actually put the breakers on the floors that they control. Now, of course, this is not a real one. This is a kind of what you say is a representation of the breakers attached to the floor plan. So it's easy to grasp the concept, right? So this is also an example of representation. So we can have a floor plan and actually put the breakers on the floors that they control. Or even if we want to get really crazy, we could even put the breakers in the rooms themselves. So if the power goes out to a certain room, I just go find the breaker in that room. But there we are starting to run into some of the other constraints on the problems. So it's probably best to stick to what we can control without requiring the physical device we manufactured differently in the first place. So how can we see the representation in interfaces? Representations are all around us in real world, but they play a huge role in interfaces. Designing representations of the current state of a system is actually one of the most common tasks you might perform as an interface designer. So let's take a look at few. So this is a Google Calendar. Here's a Google Calendar which is a representation of my week. Notice how it actually uses space to represent blocks of time. It allows me to quickly feel how long different things are going to take. An alternate visualization might show an entire month instead of a week. Now if you just change this option to month from this drop down menu, it will show you a different representations. But it would lose those indicators that link the individual appointments. So it does not really represent the structure and pace of my day the way the weekly calendar does. This representation also allows me to very easily find conflicts in my schedule. Of course, there are no conflicts right now, but you can try to insert a overlapping schedule and see that how it represents in that particular interface. So I know when I might need to reschedule something by just visualizing. Another example of this is the PowerPoint animation time. The numbers here represent when different animations happen concurrently. Like this. This is 1, 1 and 2. The middle icon represents what triggers the animation, like click or something else, and the right icon indicates the general nature of the animation, whether it's a movement, a highlight, or an appearance. The PC version of PowerPoints makes this even better by actually showing you a timeline of the different animations to the right. That lets you very easily visualize when two different things are going to happen at the same time, or when something waits for something else to happen. These are just two of the many representations you use whenever you use a computer. Like scroll bars. Scroll bars, for example, are representations of your relative position in a document. Highlighting markers, like that rectangle, are representations of what you currently have selected. All these representations work together to help your mental model match the real state of the system. Representations, when used correctly, can make many tasks trivial or even invisible. And we as interface designers have a lot of control over representations in our design. Now let's talk a little bit about metaphors and analogy, which again is an important concept. Analogies and metaphors are powerful tools for helping users understand your interface. If you can ground your interface in something they already know, you can get a solid foundation in teaching them how to use your interface. For example, the Wall Street Journal's website. It heavily leverages on analogy to the Wall Street Journal print edition. The headlines, the grids, the text all appear pretty similarly to someone familiar with the print edition could pretty easily understand the online edition. If you have ever tried to explain a tool that you use to someone who have never seen it, you will probably encounter something like this. If you have never actually seen Slack, it's a chat app that lets organizations communicate in public and private rooms. But listen to what I just said. It's a chat app. In my description, I leveraged the analogy to something you have already seen. Now Slack is a pretty easy example because it is a chat app. It's barely even an analogy to say it's like a chat app because it is a chat app. It's a very fully featured chat app with a lot of integrations and things like that, but it's fundamentally a chat app. What about something harder? How about Medium? Have you ever heard of Medium? So Medium is a writing platform that kinds of like a blogging service, but also kind of like a publishing service, but also kind of like a newsfeed. You write articles kind of like WordPress, blog posts, but you can publish them through organization which is kind of like traditional newspapers or news aggregators like the Huffington Post. My articles are published through University of St. So it's not just like a blog because it's not just my personal blog. There is a publisher element to it. But the actual content is very similar to a blog-like platform. Articles are then published to interested people more like a newsfeed. As you can see, Medium sends me daily digest of articles which it thinks I would be interested in reading. And in that way, it's more like Facebook or Twitter because it kinds of suggest you something based on your interests. So notice that my entire explanation of Medium was based on analogies to other services like WordPress, Huffington Post, and Facebook. But analogies and metaphors have a downside. When you choose to use them, users don't know where the analogy ends. When I describe Medium's newsfeed, it is a kind of like Facebook or Twitter. Users might wonder where to retweet or share the options are. Or when I describe it like a blog platform such as WordPress, people might wonder whether the comments are, and it doesn't really supply comments in the way that we are used to. So while analogies are powerful ways to help users understand our interfaces, we also need to pay special attention to what misconceptions they might introduce. So let's have a look at the exploration of metaphors and analogies. One of the challenges encountered by every new technology is helping the user understand how to use it. The smartphones may be pretty ubiquitous by now, but we are still figuring out some elements of how to best use these things. Typing efficiency on a touch screen, for example, still hasn't caught up to efficiency with a full keyboard. But that's because typing on a phone was also a pretty straightforward transition from a regular keyboard. Because the on-screen keyboard was designed just an analogy to the real one. There are probably more efficient ways to enter text into a phone, but it wouldn't be as easily learnable as this straightforward analogy to a physical keyboard. For instance, Twiddler. Now this illustrates both the positive and negative sides of using analogies in design. So the analogies make the interface more learnable, but they may restrict the interface to outdated constants. So take a moment and think about how this applies to your chosen area of HCI. If you are looking at things like gestural interfaces or touch-based interfaces, what analogies can you draw to other interfaces to make your designs more learnable? And at the same time, what do you risk by using those analogies? So reflect these changes in, let's make this an assignment for your next week. Take your mini project, for instance, And let me know in your assignment that what kind of analogies you will prefer for your interface to be learnable, and how those analogies will help your interface to make some affordances or to make some consistencies, and also write or reflect that how these analogies can affect your application or your interface brand's name, how it can go wrong, or how it can contribute to the downside for your interface. So try these three things, that how your what kind of analogy you will make, or with which platform or with which interface you will make the analogy of your HCI application which you have designed in your mini project, how these analogies would make your interface more learnable, and what will be the downside of using those analogies with respect to your interface which you have designed in your mini project. So let's reflect this in the assignment which you will submit by next week. So till then, goodbye, and I'll share the next video lecture in this series very soon.